This is The Future Of, where experts share their vision of the future and how their work is helping shape it for the better.
I'm David Blaney. For decades, inefficient batteries prevented a large-scale shift to renewable energy sources such as solar and wind because they couldn't store enough energy to tide us over while the sun wasn't shining or the wind wasn't blowing. But now that's all changed, of course. Lithium battery technology has evolved to the point where we could feasibly, with the right leadership, abandon fossil fuels within the next few decades. Hydrogen storage is yet another technology that could emerge as a viable alternative to lithium batteries before long, further fueling the renewable revolution. Today, I'm connected to Professor Jacques Eksteen, the Chief Operating Officer for the Future Batteries Industries Cooperative Research Centre, and Dr. Terry Humphries, a Curtin Research Fellow and a chemist with a particular interest in hydrogen storage. Thank you very much for your time, Jacques and Terry.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Thank you, David.
So the battery boom is pretty good news for both the planet and for Western Australia, isn't it?
Yes, I think so. I think we've got, there's a planet story, there's Australia's story, and there's a Western Australian story. I think also one has to separate, there's also a health story and an environmental story. So let's just maybe touch upon these different aspects. At the planet level, if it becomes one of the key enablers to really make the renewable energy boom happen in terms of our particularly our photovoltaic and our wind generation capability. But because of their intermittence, as you've mentioned earlier on, it is that there used to be a big problem. Even in Western Australia, we see often that we might have some surplus solar to the point that it actually might even disturb the grid. So what we see therefore with batteries is a way to not only store energy, but also to regulate and the energy in the grid, which is important because anything that's like a high spike or whatever can also create a lot of problems. And so the stabilization of that grid is a very important aspect. But also, I think the other part, what I've mentioned is and that relates naturally very well to the whole environmental aspect within how batteries are deployed in terms of its linking to the renewable devices that does not generate carbon dioxide. However, when we're talking about batteries, for instance, in electric vehicles, which is probably internationally one of the bigger users of batteries, in that case, we see actually a health benefit, and that health benefit is related to the nitrous oxide gases that come from, and the various other gases associated with internal combustion engines. And so air quality is a big issue, and it was quite notable, for instance, with this whole COVID crisis that we're in at the moment, the COVID-19 crisis, that if you look at the countries like China and Italy, once they went into lockdown, you see this huge reduction in air pollution associated mostly with the various internal combustion engines associated with cars and buses and so on. So a huge health impact, and also worldwide, if we see the number of deaths associated with air pollution, there's that significant health aspect. So I think the two aspects, therefore, to deal with is health on the one hand, which is with electric vehicles, and environment, which is related to renewable energy generation. And they deal with two quite separate aspects, but lead to a huge or massive uptake of batteries in the coming years. When we get down to Australia, and particularly Western Australia, we see that firstly, we've got all basically the materials that we will require to make batteries, and that would typically be things like lithium, nickel, manganese, and cobalt. And also we have it's not only the extraction, meaning the mining of those things, but also the refining. And so we see refineries, for instance, with BHP having a Nickel West refinery for nickel and cobalt, and companies such as Tianqi and Covalent, Albemarle, all putting plants that would manufacture lithium hydroxide, which is a refined lithium chemical going into battery cathodes. So a lot of major industries feeding into battery materials, but also there are other types of batteries, and I maybe should highlight from the beginning, it's not only lithium-ion batteries, but also things like zinc bromine batteries and vanadium redox flow batteries. Vanadium redox flow battery is an aqueous battery, which is also very well suited to grid applications and is not flammable like a lithium-ion battery. So the nice part is having all that on all those metals that would allow us to produce batteries. But also on the other side is the deployment side. Western Australia in general, but Western Australia in particular, has lots of open space. It gets a lot of wind and a lot of sun, and also have access to things like wave and water power as well. So various power, renewable power sources that can feed into a grid. And lastly, it's just the application. We've got a huge number of remote, either towns or mines or resource facilities or agricultural areas, which can benefit enormously by having microgrids, where the microgrid would be enabled with batteries. So a lot of diverse applications, and so we've got the benefit both on the application and deployment side, as well as on the materials going into batteries.
I guess one of the side effects, of course, of the COVID-19 crisis is, of course, that since we're all at home, if you've got solar panels, you're actually using the energy that you're generating rather than just sort of feeding it back into the grid. So we do need to consider, well, obviously CO2 emissions are very important, I guess, as is evident to anyone who's been paying attention to the news for between 3 and 15 seconds. We do need to consider more than just CO2 emissions, though. What are the environmental impacts of mining materials for batteries, and how does this compare to the impact of mining and burning fossil fuels?
What we've seen is a number of life cycle assessments. So there are some well-published life cycle assessments in the literature that has made these comparisons, and we see that batteries do compare and compete very well against fossil fuels. And naturally, fossil fuels is a broad range of sources. It would include coal, oil, and gas. So one should compare, and each of them have got their own footprint, which would be different from one type of fossil fuel to the next. But in batteries, what we find is that firstly, it compares very well with regards to the carbon dioxide footprint, right from the point of mining or extraction throughout the production up to the manufacture of the final cells and batteries. However, what is important is the opportunities that we've got to also make byproducts and also repurpose a lot of the materials that are viewed as waste materials. For instance, as an example, in lithium refinery, typically in hard rock that we come from, as an example, from Talison Lithium in Greenbushes in Western Australia, it goes into a Tianqi refinery. That contains about 6% lithium oxide in the spodumene, which is the mineral coming into that plant, which means that over 90% of that material is waste. But that waste is what we call an aluminosilicate waste. Is a very particular type of waste which is very useful in cement production and the manufacture of concrete. So by repurposing the waste, it allows a use in another industry, and also then provides, instead of material that would have been mined elsewhere, now becomes a useful raw material feeding in those industries. So that's an example, for instance, of how waste can be repurposed for commercial and commercial use, leading to a far more circular economy, not only in terms of final battery recycling, but actually recycling all along the way. At the mining stage, where often your mining waste is used in road aggregate and so on, up to refinery waste, which are often used in things like soil amelioration, concrete and cement production, and so on. And then subsequently, also one of the things that we as the CRC or the FBI CRC are looking at is some of the chemical waste streams as to how do we change that into a way that we can use that as fertilizer in the agricultural industry. So lots of opportunities, but even despite current opportunities, there are also, if we look at the existing waste production, it is fairly the impact of that is fairly small compared to, for instance, if you look at coal mining and coal mining waste, and then the waste associated, for instance, if you're going to have a coal-based power plant and all the ash generation associated with that. So that's the solid ash. There's also the gaseous pollutants that you would have, like sulfur that enters the atmosphere, and then mercury and stuff like that are typically part of coal as well. And then on top of that, you've got your carbon dioxide. So even with coal mining and coal burning, there's a far broader range of pollutants than only the carbon dioxide that has to be dealt with. In the case of batteries, though, we've got a lot of opportunities to repurpose these materials for commercial use and have a true circular economy around most materials going into batteries.
We've all heard about lithium-ion batteries. Pretty much everyone has a device which uses them. My phone does, my laptop does, and I'm using both of them right now. But obviously they're not the only technology that exists. Could you tell us about hydrogen fuel cells and what benefits they offer?
Yeah, so hydrogen fuel cells are basically electrochemical devices that can turn hydrogen gas into electricity. So basically the hydrogen goes into the anode and produces electrons. And the only byproduct from this, apart from the electricity, is water and heat. So if we're going to use these fuel cells in cars, for instance, we're not releasing any carbon dioxide or NOx gases or anything like that. Plus, these fuel cells have a greater efficiency than you'll get from the petrol cars, up to the order of 2 to 3 times the efficiency. So these fuel cells have already been implemented into a number of cars throughout the years. And as of 2018, there was 3 models available: the Toyota Mirai, the Hyundai Nexo, and the Honda Clarity. And so these fuel cells have been implemented all over the world as well, not just in cars, but trucks, forklifts. There's hydrogen bikes, hydrogen boats, you name it, it's happening. And also the military are starting to use hydrogen fuel cells as well, just because of their lightweight nature and the fact that they're so scalable. You can build them from just mobile applications all the way up to large-scale energy storage as well and energy production. And so that's the main benefits of them, whether it be the clean emissions, the scalability, and also the efficiency compared to fossil fuels.
No energy source, or indeed no technology, is without its critics. Part of the argument part of the argument is that that hydrogen energy storage is commonly produced using fossil fuels. Does this present a problem?
Yeah, well, that is true. I mean, as of 2015, 95% of the global hydrogen production was using fossil fuels, using thermolysis or steam methane reformation. But in recent years, this landscape is dramatically changing. And that's because of the amount of renewable energies coming to play, whether it be solar, wind. I mean, here in Perth, there's actually so much energy being produced from solar that it's overloading the grid. So we actually need a way to take some of this electricity off the grid as well. And this can actually be stored as hydrogen. So we take the excess electricity and we can pass this through an electrolyzer, which is basically conducting electrolysis of water. And this produces hydrogen, which can either be compressed and stored, or used directly in industry. And so the more and more these electrolyzers are being introduced into the landscape, they're becoming cheaper, they're getting more scalable, and so that means vast quantities of hydrogen can be produced. And so with this increase in hydrogen production, the cost will be brought down dramatically too. So once hydrogen is cheaper to produce and use than fossil fuels, then it'll be more popular to make hydrogen using green electricity rather than fossil fuels.
Terry, if I can maybe add to that, I think one of the things that even with hydrogen from let's say natural gas, the opportunity, one of the big challenges with hydrogen has been in transport and storage, and by solving, even if we solve those issues and we get it well commercialized for applications coming from natural gas. And basically piggybacking on a fairly large industry, because this is the key thing, is that often when you want to drive a new industry like a hydrogen industry, you have to have it's often useful to have a supporting industry, and the gas industry is a large industry that can help to get this thing going, and particularly with regards to storage and transport. And one of the big opportunities is also then transporting this, like we're doing with liquefied natural gas, we can also do with hydrogen to transport it into Asian countries, where a lot of these Asian countries don't have good quality renewables. So for instance, if you're Japan, for instance, it's a mountainous country where they don't have good quality sunshine across the year. They don't have good quality wind as well, so sustained wind. They don't have huge tidal sources. And so they're quite stuck in terms of their options to generate renewables. So for them, it's therefore an option to basically import hydrogen from countries such as Australia that firstly can develop it off the back of a natural gas industry, and then as the technology progresses, feed in the green hydrogen that comes from the electrolyzers into the system. So there's a sequencing or staging here in terms of the economics that's important, and where we can then facilitate the transition into a hydrogen economy for players to the north of us, to countries to the north of us, for whom a renewable generation using conventional means would be far harder and more difficult to do than for us. So it's and the other thing I think with hydrogen, which is important compared to batteries, for instance, is when we're looking at the duration of the type of time that we want to bridge. So for instance, batteries are very good for the shorter time periods, let's say up to 8 to 12 hours, but not really more than that. Whereas hydrogen allows us to span months and even seasons. So that to take out some of the seasonality that we see as well, hydrogen is that buffer that allows us to basically smooth out the effects in energy across seasons and weeks and months, which is something that batteries totally can't really do that well.
You're quite correct there. I mean, as we go forward, I think that every industry is going to play an important part. We have to put all of these resources into use together if we're going to make the most of sustainability. I mean, yeah, batteries, fantastic for short-term grid usage. We definitely need to be exporting hydrogen as well. And as you mentioned, it's a fantastic opportunity for Australia to start exporting hydrogen. But first of all, yes, we might need to use fossil fuels to produce hydrogen predominantly. But there's plenty of projects that are going on to use green electricity to produce hydrogen and send this over to Japan and Korea, etc. I mean, lucky enough at Curtin University, we've got a major project going on to be able to use solid state hydrogen storage and to be able to send this off, where we'd hopefully mine the raw materials in Australia send that to Japan, extract the hydrogen from there. Then we would send that back to Australia, where we can then recycle that material as well. So there's a number of projects going on, and definitely everything needs to be used in tandem if we're going to make the most of it.
Fossil
Yeah, I think.
sorry, you go ahead.
Sorry, so I think so. So the hydrogen economy, we should then, like with batteries, you've got fairly complex supply or value chains and so on. But hydrogen also has got in a sense, a bit of a complex value chain, in the sense you've got the generation aspect of it, you've got the compression aspect, you've got the generation, the purification, and you've got the compression and storage, and as Terry mentioned, there are a range of storage methods: solid state, or maybe in the form of liquefied ammonia, or as hydrogen, compressed hydrogen itself. So each with their own benefits from environmental safety and energy efficiency perspective. But once you store it, then it's the transport, it's the materials construction around these things, and then when we then deploy that, in the hydrogen case, it's deploying that through, for instance, the fuel cell technologies, which, as Terry mentioned, is highly efficient. But I think similarly, batteries have got this fairly complex value chain, and all the links in this chain have to work together for it to be an effective alternative economy, at a global scale.
Yes, I feel that the transport of hydrogen globally is an issue, and especially even within countries. In America, they've shown that you can use like existing pipelines from gas to transport the hydrogen as well. Other than that, we're fixed with having to use trucks to move the hydrogen. So there's a large initiative as well to make a hydrogen highway throughout WA, where trucks will be able to refuel at stations and refuel the stations as well. And these stations will also be producing hydrogen on site from renewable energy sources. So yes, definitely making a network for these materials is definitely important.
Fossil fuels are still a very lucrative industry. In fact, much of I think that's probably a bit of an understatement, much of our economy is dependent upon fossil fuels, meaning that there's going to be quite a bit of institutional resistance to moving away from them, isn't there?
Yeah, there would be. I mean, the one thing is that one have to realize if you look at there are two sides to it. One is the internal energy usage in Australia, but the big aspect really is the export side. Is the export of liquefied natural gas and the export of coal. And we can't just switch that off with a flick and then think that it's not going to have a huge economic impact on the country. So it's a matter of a gradual transition. The other thing is that we must look at alternative usage, for instance, for natural gas. So in the case of natural gas, we can produce olefins. So it's from methane, which is natural gas. You can produce something like ethylene, and which is basically the building block of your organic chemistry, all the petrochemicals that you can make from that, including food acids, amino acids that are the parts of the building blocks of proteins and so on, and various other chemicals, and which would lead to a value add. And I think that's very important. If we can go from, let's say, natural gas to olefins and hydrogen, because you can actually produce hydrogen and olefins by stripping the hydrogen off the methane, and you get ethylene gas or various olefins from that. And so that's one big opportunity to say, well, instead of necessarily just exporting to burn it, because we're actually then taking it to a very poor end product, we can actually add value to our some of these fossil fuel sources, particularly natural gas. Coal maybe is a bit more difficult. If you look at, for instance, in South Africa, you've got a company like Sasol, which manufactures petrochemicals from coal. It is a far more expensive process to do that, but it's still doable. And I think the important message that I'm trying to get across is that we can add value to fossil fuel sources instead of burning them to a very poor quality end product, which is just carbon dioxide. And that's the long game that we should be in the end. It's not. That said, it's not, as I say, it's not a matter of just flicking a switch and we go from an economy which has got strong support by fossil fuels to an economy which does not have that part in it, because the impact that it would have on taxes, the impact that it would have on employment, on the balance of payments in the country and so on, would be enormous if it's done too rapidly, and therefore a staged approach would then be more sensible.
Yes, that's quite correct. I mean, yeah, you can't go flicking a switch, and there's no discounting that we need the revenue from fossil fuels and all these industries, so for jobs and taxes. But at the same time, there has to be a transition. All of these companies recognize that too. And it's the case of all of these materials, as you said, can be value added rather than just burning them. But it's a case of preserving them for the future. It's not just finding an alternative use for them. It's keeping them for the future so that we don't run out of them in the next 100, 200, whatever number of years.
Yes, I agree. I mean, this is the key thing of they're finite resources, and it's not really recyclable in the conventional sense. At least the fossil fuels aren't. While batteries can be recycled, as an example, when you're burning coal or natural gas, you basically get into a product which is not really in a recyclable in the conventional sense. So, and you can try and sequester, for instance, some of the carbon dioxide, but it's still you're converting into a fairly useless product in the end.
Yes, quite correct. Yeah, sequestering is a great idea, but end of the day, there's only certain amounts of places that we can actually sequester this carbon dioxide to. So, yeah, definitely substitute rather than sweeping under the carpet is definitely in accord.
Or more likely underground than sort of the carpet that we call the ground, I guess. There's an Australian startup which has launched a zinc bromine gel battery. Do you think that could be another player?
So maybe we should probably. There are a range of batteries, and so I think the one thing that we should put aside first is that you've got lithium-ion batteries and also solid-state lithium batteries, but then we've got companies such as Redflow, which is a zinc bromine battery. You've got, as I've mentioned, vanadium redox flow batteries, which have originally was patented in Australia. That comes from University of New South Wales, and subsequently a lot of research internationally, and that's an aqueous system using various vanadium salts. But there are also some simple batteries, like even saltwater batteries. So it's often a question rather of fit for purpose batteries. So there are different batteries for different types of applications, and depending on your power requirements and your storage requirements per unit mass and per unit volume, the longevity of the battery that you would like, at the life that you want to get out of that battery, for instance, the things like, does it need to be non-inflammable or not? Is that a big issue or not? Are there any gases generated during the operation of the battery or not? And so all these things would then determine how it's used, for instance, in a stationary type of storage for, let's say, grid storage or microgrid storage, versus electric cars, versus batteries for submarines or in aerospace or in agriculture or in buildings. And so there are different needs. I mean, one other area which is a huge opportunity is in back into mining. For instance, mining or remote operations. It runs with underground mines, and it comes with its own particular challenges to do things at the underground level. So this whole aspect of fit for purpose batteries is important. And so instead of having a one size fits all type of approach, the battery space is got this very particular aspect of having appropriate batteries for specific needs, rather than a general approach, and so a general battery. And so lithium-ion batteries, even lithium-ion batteries, are a broad range of batteries types that you'll find under lithium-ion batteries, and selecting the right battery is very important, and that's hopefully one of the things where the Future Battery Industry CRC can support players in this space, because it seems to be sometimes a challenge to select the appropriate battery for the right application and to design the battery system. I should also add, maybe when we talk about battery versus cell, so typically you would have a single unit, which is a cell, but a battery is typically, it can be hundreds or thousands of cells that are combined into a module or a pack. And on top of that, there's what we call a battery management system, which controls its overcharging, over discharging, keeps the battery safe and cool, that it doesn't overheat. And so a battery pack has got far more to it than the individual cells, So and again, so we have to choose the correct cell chemistry on the one hand, and then subsequent to that, the correct design for going towards battery packs and the control systems that sit on top of that.
Yeah, whilst lithium-ion batteries are fantastic for multiple applications, as I mentioned before, we have to use everything in tandem. So whilst there's these different batteries being produced, like the zinc bromine batteries and the vanadium batteries, it's good to be able to use different resources from the globe. And so all of these don't become a finite resource as well, although in some regards they are. But yes, there's so many different types of batteries out there. For a larger scale battery, there's even thermal batteries that we can use as well. These can even use hydrogen and carbon dioxide as their fuel as well. And it just takes the heat, and then you can use that heat to drive a turbine later on. And you can use renewable energies to store and produce this heat as well. So there's a number of different ways that we can power the globe. And, this startup company you mentioned, I think Redflow, yes. I mean, there's multitudes of these companies coming out in Australia, and, it's a very innovative nation. And so I do feel that Australia can become one of the bigger powerhouses in the world.
Well, that's very encouraging. It's good. Well, it's good to know that we're coming up with some useful stuff. One final question before we go, and I warn you, this might reveal when we researched the brief for this particular episode, because of course this is back when we were also innocent a few months ago, before the world started ending. You might remember the Cybertruck that Elon Musk unveiled a couple of months ago. Yes or no? What do you reckon?
Oh, well, yeah, it definitely seems a beast of a vehicle. I mean, was it the most high performance version? Apparently, is going to reach 100 kilometers an hour under 3 seconds. I mean, that's pretty good going, especially using battery technology.
Jacques?
Yeah, I think it's for different tastes. I mean, in terms of shape, I guess I would have preferred a less cyberpunk shape. But I mean, in terms of its capability, it's absolutely fantastic. So I mean, I think it's hot, but I think also there's probably a specific demographic that would prefer that, and particular. I think a lot of the millennials are probably far more aligned to it than maybe the baby boomers. But I think that's much an age thing than anything else. It is I'm a Gen Xer, so I'm actually I'm same age as Elon Musk, and yeah, it's a fascinating, but not sure if I necessarily buy one for myself.
Yeah, well, they've definitely got a decent price tag on them too. Apparently, you can buy one, well, in 2021, apparently, for about 60,000 American dollars. So it's not too bad going, I say, for new technology.
Well, that translates to about about 98,000 Australian dollars. Although bearing in mind our dollar isn't very good right now, so might not be a great comparison.
Yeah, I think the important thing with like most technologies is how, over time, how the price would come down. So as soon as you get into mass production, you get into the typical lower cost of production over time. And as more competition enters that space, you'll see prices drop. So initially you'll typically find as it was with batteries themselves and with renewables as well, they started off expensive, and then there was the typical reduction that you saw over time. So a lot of the new technologies typically you would expect to be expensive at the start. The same would be even with hydrogen and so on. A lot of these things go down a learning curve, and as you go down the learning curve, you actually get significant efficiencies that you unlock, and prices would then go down.
Well, as a representative of, oh wait, I'm not a millennial actually. I think I'm a Gen Zer actually. As a 22-year-old, not really my style. I'll probably be waiting for the price drop before I spring for an electric car. I think I'm quite happy with my Commodore right now, but I probably should switch to something that's perhaps a little bit better for the environment. Jacques and Terry, thank you very much for joining me, and thanks for sharing your time to. Well, usually we say thanks for coming in, but thanks for staying at home.
Yeah,
thank you
very much.
And thank you for listening. You've been listening to The Future Of, a podcast powered by Curtin University. If you have any questions about anything we've raised today, then please feel free to get in touch by following the links in the show notes. Bye for now.